I'm a trustee of the ILC UK, and we're launching our report called Peace of Mind, Understanding the Non-Financial Benefits of Financial Advice. And I'd like to begin by thanking St James's Place for sponsoring this report. As usual, a few housekeeping rules. On the internet, we may have the odd glitch on sound and video. Please bear with us if this happens. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat function to communicate with the panelists and the delegates, as well as a Q&A feature. We'll be collecting questions for panelists as we go along. I'll try and, where they're similar, I'll try and group them together to make sure almost everybody gets a chance. If you're having any issues with the audio or the video throughout the webinar, try to connect with an Ethernet cable or through a hotspot on your phone. If you get disconnected from the webinar, do use the same link that you had for the confirmation email to join back in again. You're all invited to post comments on Twitter using hashtag Peace of Mind and @ILCUK. I should mention the webinar will be recorded and published for public access on our website and our YouTube channel. So what we'll be looking at today is whether there are non-financial benefits to taking advice, whether those who have not yet taken advice perceive that there would be benefits in doing so, whether non-financial benefits differ amongst different subgroups, including age, gender, or relative wealth, and what may be driving the non-financial benefits of advice. We'll also be hearing from our expert panel, who I'll introduce in a minute, who will be responding to the report's findings and policy recommendations. We also then please want to hear your views in the Q&A. Do submit, as I said, your questions to our speakers using the Q&A feature in the bottom bar of your screen throughout, and join the conversation, as I say, on Twitter, hashtag Peace of Mind at ILC UK. I'm going to begin by introducing our research fellow, Arun Himawan, who has done the work on this report. Arun has been with us since last year. She, prior to that, has mainly worked in the charity sector, including higher education, in policy and research. She's produced a number of in-depth pieces of research on a wide range of topics. Her research interests are in addressing social determinants of health and intergenerational issues. She has a BA from the University of Toronto in sociology and moral philosophy, an MSc from King's on global health, an MA from the School of Advanced Studies in Human Rights. And we're delighted she's with us at the ILC and has produced this report, which in a way is a sister report to our earlier one on the financial benefits, excuse me, the financial benefits of financial advice. So without further ado, I will hand over to Arun to take us through the report and her findings. Thank you, Arun.
Thank you, Nigel, and good afternoon, everyone. In recent years, everyone has had to take more responsibility of their own wealth in changes in pensions, retirement ages, as well as regulation. This includes the gradual demise of defined benefit pension schemes and the rise of defined contribution schemes, as well as the introduction of pension freedoms and the implementation of the retail distribution review. All of these changes have contributed to a widening of the advice gap, which raises significant challenges for an aging society. That said, closing the advice gap is no easy task. Both the government and the Financial Conduct Authority have been concerned about it for many years. Indeed, it is estimated that over a quarter of the British population who could benefit from financial advice currently do not receive it. This is despite there being wider evidence, including previous ILC research, that finds that those who take financial advice are better off than those who don't. And most importantly, it is those from lower wealth groups that are likely to benefit the most from taking advice. Therefore, developing a better understanding of the full value of advice, including whether there are any non-financial benefits to taking it, might prove crucial in getting more people through the door. Fortunately, there has been some real progress in this space in understanding what those non-financial benefits are, including a recent study released earlier this year by Royal London, which finds that advice improves emotional well-being by helping consumers to feel more financially secure. However, there is still much more that needs to be done in this space, and it's likely that we are underestimating the added value that the non-financial benefits of advice offers to consumers. This is why our research builds upon our earlier work, demonstrating that the value of advice extends well beyond the financial benefits and offers significant non-financial benefits as well. Next slide, please. Great. So our research posed the following 4 questions. Are there non-financial benefits to taking financial advice? And if so, what are they? Do those who have not received advice perceive there to be non-financial benefits taking it? Do perceived or actual non-financial benefits differ amongst subgroups, particularly sex, age, and wealth? And what could be driving the non-financial benefits of advice? We conducted 32 in-depth qualitative interviews, and we held 2 expert roundtables. Of the 32 participants that we interviewed, half had taken advice and half hadn't taken advice. We got also an almost even gender split as well. We interviewed those between the ages of 30 and 74, and these were further grouped into distinct age cohorts. These included those between the ages of 30 and 44, 45 and 54, and 55 and 74. We also grouped people into higher and lower wealth group categories. For our expert roundtables, we specifically heard from people from the wider financial service industry, third sector organizations, as well as government. Next slide, please. So the initial phase of our work was that we wanted to understand whether the advice impacts the extent to which people feel confident in their financial preparedness to support their long-term goals. And what we did is we looked at those who did take advice and compared their responses against those who hadn't taken advice. And what we find is that those who take advice are much more confident about their financial future and better prepared for retirement. In particular, these participants spoke about how they spent considerable time thinking about how they would finance their retirement. And this was evidenced by having milestones in place to ensure that they were on track. Participants spoke about how in the next 5, 10, 15 years that they would reevaluate their financial situation, consider the progress they had made toward their long-term goals, and consider if any changes had to still be made. They also had a very clear focus on their end goal. For many, this was having a comfortable lifestyle, life in retirement, being able to be financially independent. They were very much focused on making sure that they could meet those. And they also spoke a lot about how they had built a diverse portfolio of assets. And this had absolutely added to their added sense of confidence and the feeling that they were better prepared. The sorts of assets that they had accumulated over time included owning more than one property, making additional contributions to their workplace pension, owning additional private pension, having stocks and shares, ISAs, premium bonds, and taking out insurance products. What is particularly interesting about this group was that demographics had very little impact on their responses. Next slide, please. Now, when we take a look at those who hadn't taken advice, what we find is they're much more likely to talk about feeling worried. This included feeling worried about whether they would have enough retirement income, including the impact that this could have on their family. Some showed a preference for spending today rather than saving for the future. And some spoke about the difficulty they faced in balancing and maintaining their current lifestyle with ensuring that they had enough in retirement. They felt that this was generally a very difficult problem for them to solve. Women, particularly in the oldest age group, talked about feeling less confident about whether they would realize their life goals. They spoke about how they were starting to take the next steps to prepare, but many of them continued to still feel unprepared for retirement. Interestingly, among this group, we also found there were certain groups who did express confidence. So this was particularly among the youngest age group. They felt that their confidence came from from the fact of having a pension, as well as being able to save on a regular basis, but these were mostly in current cash accounts, and as well as being able to make those shorter term investments. Overwhelmingly, they felt that they still had a lot of time to prepare, and they had many other financial commitments that for them took much more priority than saving for later life, particularly ensuring that they were able to pay off their mortgage, being able to financially support their children through university. They felt that it was once until their children were finally settled that they could start thinking about themselves and their future. So I think what this research generally shows is that it's overwhelmingly the case that advice is likely to result in people feeling more confident and feeling more prepared about their financial future. Next slide, please. So the next phase of our research, we wanted to understand whether there were non-financial benefits to taking financial advice. And what we found were there are significant non-financial benefits. So among those who had taken advice, the first one being that they felt that they had improved financial literacy. What was interesting was that gender did impact these responses. So for men, it helped them feel more confident in new ways of investing and to taking on appropriate levels of investment risk. Whereas women spoke about how financial advice empowered them to make informed decisions about their future. Men spoke about how advice gave them greater control of their financial future. However, they spoke about it in different ways. For example, one individual spoke about how it was the active decision of speaking to an advisor that helped them feel more in control of their finances. Another one, for example, spoke about how because they weren't the only one monitoring their finances, they had someone else to support them. They felt that they were more in control as a result. Generally, those from the oldest age group spoke about how advice made them feel more reassured. Greater reassurance came from knowing that they were doing the right thing by consulting an expert and thereby avoiding constant self-questioning about whether their decisions were right or whether they were wrong. Participants also spoke about how having a financial advisor helped them feel more reassured that they weren't missing anything. And others spoke about how they felt more reassured that they were more or less on the right track to meet their long-term goals. Participants also talked about, as you can imagine, a boost in confidence. This was a boost in confidence in knowing that they were planning, they had planned properly for their financial future. For example, some specifically spoke about how they had a clear understanding of their long-term goals and how they were going to achieve them. And one individual spoke about how it gave them this additional self-confidence in the way they approach financial matters, both independently, but then also with other people, their friends and their family members. Participants also spoke about how advice made them worry less and offered increased peace of mind and security. It was generally those who had taken advice on an ongoing basis that were more likely to report this non-financial benefit. But it was generally the sense that they had safeguarded their future by making changes to their finances. Next slide, please. So when we look at those who hadn't taken advice, what we find is they actually expected much of the same benefits, but women in particular worried about some potential drawbacks. This included the fact that advice could potentially result in a loss of control. So they felt that because they were no longer the sole person in charge of their financial decision-making, because they had someone else involved, they felt that advisors might be able to make changes to their finances without their knowledge. What is very interesting about this finding is that when we actually compare this to women who took advice, they also speak about this initial worry that they could lose control. However, they do then go on to say how they were able to build a positive relationship with their advisor and that actually they were able to overcome that control quite quickly. So this suggests that this perception is a misperception and that more really needs to be done to ensure that women understand that once they do take advice, they're able to continue to retain that control that they feel comfortable with. Women also reported that that advice could increase their worry. They felt that their worries would be less if their advisor provided solutions that they could easily implement. However, if their financial problems were too complex, they were worried that their advisor wouldn't be able to suggest actions that were within their capacity to implement. This suggests that they have this view that advisors are unable to tailor their recommendations to their specific needs. So there's definitely more that needs to be done to show that advisors can have, are able to offer solutions to a wide variety of people's financial circumstances. And then one last thing to mention here is that because these participants were from the lower wealth group, it might be because their specific financial circumstances are particularly complex that they were more likely to talk about how advice could increase their worry. Next slide, please. All right, so the next phase of our research, we wanted to understand what were the sorts of things, skills, qualities, characteristics that people valued that were likely to result in non-financial benefits. So we asked those who took advice what sorts of things they value that their advisor offered them. And we asked those who didn't take advice what sorts of things they would value if they did take advice. What we find is that while both advised and non-advised participants value the same characteristics, the latter are more skeptical about whether some of these benefits existed and how to find advisors that could deliver them. What is quite a crucial finding, however, that sort of underscores all of these is the fundamental role that trust plays in these relationships. So beginning with advisor characteristics, when we look at those who took advice, we find that they value their advisor having the requisite expertise and the ability to explain finances. They do, however, place a greater importance on the ability to explain finances, the ability to explain their knowledge in a clear and simple manner, and their ability and their advisor's ability to explain the risks associated with their investments. Those who didn't take advice, however, while they did value these, they weren't always clear about whether advisors actually had the requisite expertise, whether they had those qualifications to be able to offer the right advice that they needed. Participants who took advice also valued advisors who took an impartial approach, and this meant different things for different people. So for some, it was the fact that they had an independent financial advisor, and they drew the distinction between independent financial advice and then advice that was offered in banks. Some, however, really valued a more extreme approach, impartial approach that their advisors took. So there were examples where their advisor might have directed them elsewhere where they felt there was a better product suited to them, or there were instances where they said, that they would show their client how they could actually do some of the tasks themselves, thereby reducing the overall potential advisor costs. Those who didn't take advice, however, were very much wary about whether advisors were able to offer an impartial approach to the advice that they gave. They felt that advisors would not be honest, and they felt that advisors wouldn't be acting in their best interest. However, what we can see is that actually the experience of advisors is very different to the people who haven't taken advice, their expectation of what advisors offer. The other skill that people very much value is having people skills. So this was the view that, people who took advice felt that that many of them were able to deliver have strong emotional intelligence, particularly adopting a gentle attitude, showing empathy, being genuine, and taking interest in them as an individual rather than a client. Those who hadn't taken advice also placed importance on advisors showing empathy and being able to understand their situation. Interestingly, again, those who had taken advice also spoke about how they felt it was really important. They valued it when their advisor was able to ensure that they were able to make their decisions on their own, so not being pushed to make decisions unless they were really comfortable about them. And that was really important. That helped to build trust and to show and to demonstrate that the advisors were acting in their best interests. So we move on to service characteristics. The first service characteristic being tailored advice. Those who took advice really value their advisor taking the time to understand their goals and designing a financial plan that would support them. They also value their advisor taking a holistic approach to the financial advice that they gave, not just looking at their finances, but looking at their lifestyle, looking at their health as well, and also involving other family members in those decisions as well. Generally speaking, the more personalized the advice felt to participants, the more they felt that they had been listened to, and that their advisor was offering something that they needed, the more confident they felt in the advice given. We also spoke to some participants who had taken advice and had also taken face-to-face guidance, and we asked what their experiences of the two were. And they overwhelmingly mentioned that they felt that advice was much more tailored to their circumstances. They felt that advice offered much more varied and advanced products. And so there's clear distinction between sort of advice and guidance and the value that people place on those two. Those who hadn't taken advice also valued advisors to offer tailored advice. In fact, they actually expected it because they were paying for the service. So it's quite interesting when you think about the sorts of things that participants value and the way that these perceptions are shaped. Some are based on general perceptions, but some are based on sort of more of the regulations and more of the way in which advice is offered to the public. Face-to-face relationships were important for both groups as well. This was quite vital to building trust and helping build confidence in the relationship. In fact, there was a instance of one individual who spoke about how they had approached several advisor firms, and it was the one that had the initial face-to-face conversation with them that helped them make the decision to go with that advisor. Those who hadn't taken advice, again, they also valued this. They felt that it was important that their advisor appeared to them as honest and genuine and looking out for their best interests. And that face-to-face relationship was how they felt that could be, that advisors can show those values to them properly. Participants also valued ongoing relationships. However, this was only a minority of those who hadn't taken advice talked about ongoing relationships. This might be because they're unaware that these are available to them. But those who had taken advice felt that ongoing relationships helped to build security and peace of mind, and that they generally valued having someone that was easily contactable. What's interesting about this finding, however, is that many spoke about how they spoke to their advisor over phone or over video chat. So this suggests that while the face-to-face relationship might be important for the initial discussion that they have with their advisor, when it's an ongoing relationship, it doesn't have to be a face-to-face one. Both groups again spoke about how it was important to have a wide range of financial options. Participants who took advice reported that they valued knowing that they'd considered all those options available to them, and that they were able to take the right actions that would support their long-term goals. Those who hadn't taken advice also valued having a range of financial options. They felt that they would develop sort of financial literacy skills as a result of that. And then finally, it was only those who'd taken advice who talked about having a detailed financial plan and how they valued that. Quite a few participants were actually surprised at the level of specificity that the kinds of questions that the advisors put to them. And this was something that they actually they spoke very positively about. So there seems to be a lot of different ways in which different skills that advisors have, and the different sort of service skills, characteristics that are offered to clients that they value and that are likely to result in experiencing these non-financial benefits. Next slide, please. So we finally asked those who hadn't taken advice, what sorts of barriers do they experience? And there were a few interesting findings here. So first being general raising awareness and rebranding. Participants felt that there needed to be more marketing and better marketing that appealed to their emotions. People felt marketing that spoke about changes in policy didn't really speak to them at a very individual level, and they were unlikely to be interested in what financial advice has to offer. Generally, participants also spoke about how there needed to be much more clarity around advice services. So understanding what advice is, what it's not, what it can offer in terms of financial benefits, what it can offer in terms of non-financial benefits, and clear communication about how regulations can protect the public. Participants also spoke about how there generally needed to be easier for them to find a recommended advisor. For some, it was they needed to have a clearer pathway to find that advisor. So for some, they felt that the financial advice sector, as well as the public and government sites, needed to improve access to these advice services. They needed it to be more streamlined. It was a little bit confusing where to go. They felt that some of the advice offered was slightly, or the guidance that was offered slightly different. They weren't too sure which ones to follow, and it didn't seem like there was a very clear entry point into understanding about financial advice and getting help with regard to their finances. Participants also spoke a lot about having very objective, independent customer reviews and how this could help them encourage them to take advice. However, it was important that these would be independent and that they were vetted by an impartial body so that they knew that they were honest and not cherry-picked by financial firms. They also suggested a free financial equivalent of which. Next slide, please. So just some final thoughts. I think what's very clear from this research, and I think what the research demonstrates, is that advice is much more than a transactional relationship. It's about advisors helping their clients realize and develop their financial goals. And it's about an advisor supporting them throughout this life journey that they have. However, roundtable attendees did speak about how this view is at odds with the consumer perception as they continue to view advice as simply being about their financial assets. Given that many are likely to experience non-financial benefits much sooner than any of the financial benefits, these types of benefits are likely to be much more important for well-being and mental health And finally, it was clear from the roundtable attendees, again, that there was much more that needed to be done to improve the uptake of advice. And if we wanted to close the advice gap, we needed collaboration across the broader financial services industry, the regulator and the government. And that we need to ensure that the wider public understands that financial advice offers the skills and the qualities that they value when it comes to the advisor and client relationship. Thank you very much.
Well, Arun, thank you very much for that. Slightly breathless summary of a very long and detailed report. I'm now going to ask Jackie Wells to pull out some of the policy implications of the report. Jackie is an old friend of the ILC. She was one of the first associate fellows, and she's been involved with a lot of our projects over the years. She's had a 30-year experience in financial services markets. She's worked closely with the FCA and prior to the FSA, as well as with DWP, Treasury and various industry bodies. She was a board member of the CII for 6 years. And she's been head of policy and research at NAPF PLSA, and recently has been advisor to the chair of the expert panel reviewing the university's superannuation scheme. Well, good luck with that. So she's used to controversy and huge policy issues. So without further ado, Jackie, please give us your thoughts.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you, Arun, for taking us through those findings. I think it's both reassuring and important in equal measure, really, to hear that positive feedback from those using advice, and some of the positive messages that Arun's described from those who aren't taking advice as well. And those who are taking advice, they certainly see it as an important nudge to do the right thing about retirement planning. And they also clearly feel better prepared as a result of receiving advice, better prepared than they feel they would have been had they not done so. And this feedback seems particularly important in the light of a number of other recent reports indicating that failing to seek advice can contribute to poor outcomes as people access their pensions. And clearly pensions aren't the only aspect of financial advice, but they're increasingly an important part. And this ILC research does seem to provide an indication that advice could lead to better retirement outcomes if those taking advice follow through their plans. The most recent research from the DWP on the subject of pension freedoms draws an important connection between financial capability and the actions taken by people in connection with their pension freedoms. Those with lower levels of financial confidence or capability, admittedly self-reported, were less likely to seek formal advice or guidance and relied instead on family and friends. And other research has indicated that not seeking guidance or advice leads to people being more likely to access their pensions early, which could be a poor outcome for people. So this presents us with something of a dilemma, actually. So on the one hand, this particular piece of research we're talking about today suggests that advice may help to improve financial capability and confidence. But on the other hand, low levels of capability and confidence inhibit people from using advice services. So we're caught in a loop there. And resolving this dilemma, of course, is not simple, but finding ways of helping people access advice with confidence needs to be part of the solution. And this research provides a number of clues as to how more people might gain access to advice with confidence. But sadly, as I've said, there are no simple answers to this. It's an issue we've been dealing with for many, many years. It's also clear from this and other research that people's memories are long when it comes to bad press stories about advice, and that good changes that have taken place in the sector since RDR have yet to resonate fully, particularly with those who haven't taken advice. So perceptions are very much out of sync, really, with the reality of the times. So in order to explore some more of the policy implications of this research, we convened two roundtables with a number of industry and policy experts. And we discussed the research findings themselves, but also the broader policy implications. If we could go to the next slide. So in both roundtables, we sought to draw out the views of experts on a range of issues highlighted by the report. Among those issues, we discussed the importance of advice in helping people towards good outcomes in retirement. While automatic enrolment has done much to extend retirement savings, it's also clear that many people are making decisions at retirement without understanding the long-term consequences of their actions for themselves and for their families. There was consensus amongst the roundtable participants that more people accessing guidance and advice as they approach and enter retirement would be a good outcome for any policy initiative. We discussed the role that industry could play in promoting the benefits of advice more widely, and the role of industry in increasing the supply of advice, and what that advice should look like if it is to reach a wider audience, perhaps those in particular with lower wealth. Inevitably, and I think encouragingly, there were very differing views among those on the roundtable on the shape of advice and the ability of the sector to widen access, something I'll come back to in a moment. And we also in the roundtables touched on the role of the regulator and the government in supporting access to advice. While the participants in the roundtable made no major suggestions for change in regulation, it was felt that there are some opportunities for the FCA and the government to support industry initiatives. Next slide, please. The roundtable participants agreed that one of the most significant barriers to more people seeking out advice is a lack of awareness of what advice can offer. While this research didn't focus unduly on the barriers to taking advice, there is other research that has done that. It did highlight that those not seeking advice don't always understand clearly that advice would be personalized to their circumstances. They don't always understand that advisors are required to be qualified and are experienced in a whole range of financial matters. They don't understand necessarily the distinction between different types of advisors. Some seem stuck in the old definitions of independent and tied, and they don't understand how to go about finding an advisor. So raising awareness of the benefits of advice was felt to be something that everyone in the sector could contribute to. However, several participants in the roundtable felt that there were other important barriers to be overcome before access to advice could be widened out. We could go to the next slide. Several participants in the roundtable suggested that increasing demand for advice will only be successful if it can be matched by an increase in the supply of advice. Some felt that the reduction in advisor numbers was not only contributing to the issue of access, but also to an increase in the cost of advice. As a result, some felt that the scope for increasing access to advice was limited, in part due to advice being unaffordable to those with less wealth than the current client base. For some, the answer to widening access lies in extending the supply and the role of guidance, perhaps making guidance the default for those approaching retirement. Others felt that technology can provide solutions through robo-advice. However, most agreed that neither guidance nor robo-advice would be likely to yield all of the benefits of advice that have been highlighted by this research, many of which come from the personal, one-to-one, face-to-face interaction between client and advisor. Others felt that advice models needed to be reviewed to understand more clearly whether they meet the diverse needs of the 18.2 million people that the FCA has identified as potentially benefiting from advice but not currently taking it. Next slide, please. Reaching a set of recommendations from this research has not been easy, and there's a very good reason for that. We've been considering the issue of the advice gap for many, many years now, and many people have worked on different initiatives to try to achieve that. The industry, consumer groups, regulators and governments have known for many years that there is a problem that needs resolving, and we've had several serious attempts to address the question of access to advice. However, this research does add to the debate in identifying that the benefits of advice are not only financial in nature, but can add levels of confidence, capability, and peace of mind. And in the light of that and the discussions of the roundtable, we've proposed 3 broad sets of recommendations. Firstly, and perhaps most obviously, there's a role for the sector to work individually and collectively to promote the benefits of taking advice. And this could involve further collaboration between guidance and advice services. Secondly, the research suggests that there's considerable scope for appealing to a more diverse customer group, perhaps through a different approach to the marketing of advice, as Arun mentioned earlier, and one that feels more appropriately targeted to a wider audience. Inclusive design principles could also be applied to thinking about the needs of a more diverse customer group, whether defined by gender, age, ethnicity, or levels of wealth. Such an approach could include different methods of outreach, perhaps midlife reviews or reaching out in non-traditional community settings. And other changes could include a different approach to recruitment or training of advisors, but also the design of different components of the business model. And finally, improving the supply and efficiency of advice will be necessary if increased demand is going to be met. This might be achieved in part through greater integration between face-to-face advice and technology. It will also require a renewed focus on financial advice as an attractive career choice. More diverse business models could also help to attract more people into advice. What the research and roundtables demonstrated to us is that the debate about accessibility of advice and its value to individuals and society continues to be important, but that solutions continue to require individual and collective efforts from the sector. Importantly, they will also require continued support from other stakeholders, and in particular, a regulatory environment that is supportive of building a more diverse and vibrant advice sector. And we'd welcome your views later on this, and I can see that a number of people have submitted Q&A. But we're first going to hear, I think, from our panel members. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. That's very well put together and summarised, I think. We're now going to move on to our panel, who are each going to talk for about 5 minutes before we get into Q&A. As Jackie pointed out, we seem to be getting a lot of questions, which is good, really encouraging, and we'll try and deal with as many of those as we can later on. But let's move on to the panel. The first speaker is Andrew Cullen-Jones, who's at St James's Place. And again, we're grateful to him and his colleagues for their support in producing this report. He joined them in September 2013 from Friends Life, where he was responsible for the wealth management proposition for their international business. He currently runs a division with responsibility for product proposition and pricing, advice policy and business assurance. as well as technical support to the firm's 4,300 advisors. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you, Jackie and Aaron, for presenting the findings of the research so clearly. We first spoke to ILC about this piece of work probably around 18 months or so ago, following their previous quantitative research looking at the value of advice. We considered their previous analysis to be one of the most robust, looking at real client outcomes and the impact that financial advice had on prosperity across the full wealth spectrum of the UK population. The findings clearly demonstrated the tangible value of advice, concluding that the financial benefits of advice more than outweighs the costs associated with it. We were keen, however, to consider whether there were additional benefits of advice beyond the pure financial ones. The key findings from this research are consistent with those which we found when surveying our own clients. Firstly, that when thinking about financial future, an individual's biggest worry is often a concern of having sufficient savings for a comfortable retirement, and indeed looking further ahead to provide for any long-term care needs. Secondly, that working with an advisor to provide a plan and to prepare for and guide you through retirement yields considerable benefits, both financially, as shown by the previous ILC research, and non-financially in terms of some of the key headlines from this research: improved financial literacy, greater control, greater reassurance, a boost in confidence, less worry, and ultimately greater peace of mind. Moving on to the so what of the research, given the undoubted benefits found across the full range of the wealth spectrum, we fully believe that a key part of the answer has to lie in finding ways to increase the supply of advisors in the UK. It is telling that the UK today has half as many financial advisors per capita of population as both the US and Australia, two countries with similar demographic challenges, and indeed in terms of their approach to retirement and the responsibilities placed on the individual to manage it for themselves. The other key part of the research that jumped out for me is that the policy answer can't be purely answered by technology and transactional-based advice. The non-financial benefits are delivered through long-term trusted relationships built up over many years through regular ongoing advice, enabling the client and advisor to really generate a bond of trust. There is undoubtedly a role for technology to play, but this has to be to support the efficiency of the advisor, as without such a human relationship, many of the non-financial benefits are unlikely to be delivered. The retail distribution review undoubtedly increased the professionalism and qualifications across the industry, but it also significantly reduced the supply of advice, an industry which has its own demographic challenges in terms of the number of advisors due to leave or retire from the industry over the coming years. With that in mind, there is a real opportunity for industry, regulators, government and policymakers to work together to deliver a vibrant, professional, qualified and diverse advisor population to take us through the 2020s and beyond, and deliver real benefits and value to clients, both financially through increased prosperity and non-financially through peace of mind. Thank you.
Elementary mistake there, I'll start again. We'll now move on to our second panellist, who's Nigel Mills MP, an old friend of the ILC and someone who's carved out a real niche in the House of Commons on financial services issues. Nigel is a Member of Parliament for Amber Valley. He was elected first in 2010. He sits or has sat on no less than 4 select committees, which shows he's a glutton for punishment, and most relevant for us, I guess, is work and pensions, which we know he's been a long-standing member of and made very significant contributions. So without further ado, Nigel, over to you.
Nigel, thank you for that generous introduction. It's always great to see another Nigel, if nothing else. And we picked a good day for this because we have the pension schemes bill in Parliament, so I've got to rush off after this to speak about guidance for people approaching retirement, which I think is one of the important challenges which flows neatly from what we're saying here. And I was struck when I was reading this report through that it took me back to my days as a tax advisor and reminded me actually that most of my clients actually didn't want sexy planning schemes or to pay less tax than they owed. What they wanted to be confident was that they knew what tax they owed and they'd paid the right amount, and there were no nasty surprises coming a couple of years later when the revenue went through their affairs. And that peace of mind and the reassurance was probably as important to them as actually the tax return or the tax calculation. But that, of course, didn't mean they wanted to pay more tax than they had to. So that you had to get the advice right, but it wasn't just the numbers they cared about, it was the reassurance it provided. I think that's the finding that I took most from this report, that actually there's that reassurance, that security that you're doing the right thing, you've not missed something, you've not done something stupid, and this won't all go wrong horribly on you in a couple of years' time is the main thing that's being sold here. And that does leave that very great challenge of making sure that the people providing this advice know what they're talking about and are doing it in the interests of their client and not themselves. I think that is the progress that the ban on commissions has really made, that we can all be sure now that I'm not being sold the product with the highest commission rather than the one that's right for me. But I agree with all the previous speakers that we have some huge remaining challenges in terms of accessibility and take up of advice, and how we close that gap is the big challenge that finds us. And the data is very clear, as I've been looking at on pensions, that far too few people take advice or guidance. They've saved money for all those years, they get to the point of retirement, they don't really understand what the options are, so they just default into their existing provider and whatever they're offering them without really thinking through whether it meets their needs or what else might be out there. So the question is, how can we close that gap? And that's quite hard when people don't have huge amounts of savings, so they don't perceive, and that may be right, it may be wrong, that actually the amount of benefit they might get from advice would outweigh the cost of taking it. So that there's a challenge of how can we get good quality advice or guidance to be cheaper than it is, and either act as a gateway to full cost advice or be sufficient in itself. So that is a challenge that policymakers and regulators have to try and work through, is how do we close the gap between the theoretical guidance on what the options might be and actual advice on what you ought to do? And is there a way of having kind of risk-free advice where you don't pay for a full personalised service, but you get given some sensible suggestions for what you could do, on the understanding, of course, that you wouldn't have the legal recourse on those if the wrong thing was done. I'm not quite sure how you close the gap and where you would draw the line between what you could and couldn't do, but I think that is where we need to be thinking through, can robo-advice close that gap? But if you don't get the personal service and the personal reassurance, I'm not sure you'll get quite the same outcomes, the same reassurance, the same belief that what you've got is really what you want. So I think this very important, very interesting research just reinforces the problems that we all know are there, that if you can afford advice and you have it, you're generally very happy with it and it's a great thing to have, but too few people are doing it and too few people can probably afford to do it in a good way, and we need to find a way of closing that gap. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for that. I'm now passing the baton to Tish Hanifan, who's a very old friend of ours, founder of Society of Later Life Advisors. She's a former board director of Solicitors for the Elderly, where she's head of business development, and is also vice chair of the Kent branch of the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners. I doubt if there's anyone more qualified than Tish to talk about the nitty-gritty of actually advising particularly older people or people about their old age than Tish. So Tish, it's over to you. I think you may be muted. Tish, are you there? I think you're muted, Tish.
Hello. Yes, apologies. I'm not only muted, I'm also not able to be seen either. This is the benefits of technology, I'm afraid. Nigel, thank you for that introduction. I'm sure everybody that's read the research and listening today thinks that research is a fantastic piece of research. So I'd really like to thank the LC for it. There can be no one in financial services that can't take something really useful from this. It's given us all, I think, food for thought. So I would just like to look at two things, really. One, I'd just like to, the things that have come out at me, well, obviously in relation to the work that we do with Solar and Society of Later Life Advisors, very interesting to see that one of the things that was valued was this whole thing around what we might call soft skills. And I've seen one of the questions coming up as well around, you know, mental health and well-being and how financial services can help with that. Yeah, we couldn't really go through without mentioning the pandemic. And I would say that that has truly emphasized the benefits for people that have financial advice of having, if you like, someone to navigate through uncertain times. And I think that's one of the things that financial advice can really do. And undoubtedly adds to people's feelings of well-being, and is very well much aligned with the concerns the Financial Conduct Authority obviously have around vulnerability. So stressed in that report were things such as, am I doing the right thing? And I think that's one of the things that trust and confidence is absolutely vital. To get to that though, I also thought of how important it did seem there, going back to soft skills. You know, what do soft skills mean? And maybe just throwing out here some of the things that in financial services everybody could do. Maybe the rebranding, if you like, the better marketing of that part that came out in the research, which was the part around saying it isn't just about your qualifications. What those that have financial advice are really benefiting is that other thing, the part of having things clearly explained to them, and of being able to have those kind of conversations that give them reassurance. So for example, just to say really briefly about when I decided to found Solar, I asked age concern, help the aged and which, and I said to all of them, you know, you've been critical of financial services in some ways. So help me, tell me what you would look for in a good financial advisor and help me set up this accreditation. And the thing they all said, which has come out in this research really is, you know, you can take for granted in a way that people have got the qualifications, although the research indicates that people don't really have confidence in those because they don't necessarily understand them. But you can see they've got the qualifications, but that doesn't mean that you would necessarily start to build trust with them. And what they all said was, we want soft skills. We want a way in which to demonstrate that not only do you have these skills, but you can apply them in a way that helps me. And that's why with Solar, we do a face-to-face Fiver. I think this research, you know, that backs that up. And what we've been doing in the pandemic is having an emphasis on getting our advisors trained in what we've called difficult conversations and compassionate conversations. And that really links with another aspect of this, which is the report saying something which I think we all think is very important. That financial advice isn't just transactional, it's about an ongoing relationship. And if we were marketing and rebranding financial services, I think that's something the consumer really does need to understand, the benefit of that. And with things such as difficult conversations, for example, I think you can look at, in the pandemic, a lot of people have had to address things they haven't had to address before. And there was some research done by Solicitors for the Elderly, which was about, have people had conversations which they've then extended to professionals around difficult topics? For example, what they would want to do with things such as care funding, would they want to? How, you know, and that leads to them being able to integrate financial advice into that. And it's very much around financial advisors are well positioned to have those difficult conversations because they can, if you like, sit between families. A lot of advisors do multi-generational advice, for example. So So I think all those things together are things that financial advisors truly add value. And just finally, this aspect of technology is important, because technology undoubtedly allows access to information. And what we in financial services, what this report shows us is, I think you can use technology to get the information. You need guidance to get people to start to look at how they might actually do something. And that's where bridging that gap with things like the money and pension services is so important, working with them to bridge that gap and finally get to the point where you have financial advice. So if I had three things I'd say that I think financial services could help with this, it's perhaps stressing more in terms of branding and marketing, in highlighting the emphasis of the non-technical skills that finance.
Thank you very much, Tish.
Financial advisors bring to build more long.
Tish, you there?
I am here.
I wasn't sure if you'd finished or you just faded out
I think it was that faded out, but just to finish, I would say that I'd like to say I think this report gives us the opportunity in financial services to look at the bits that people tell us about why they don't give advice, take advice, are every bit as important as a reassurance of the value that those who do take advice show in this report.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Tish. I hope we've actually now finished rather than stopped due to technology. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next and final panelist, Tim Fassam, who's Director of Government Relations and Policy at PIMFA. And for those who aren't into initials, that's the Personal Investment Management and Financial Advice Association. Tim joined as Director of Government Relations and Policy in March this year. He's responsible for their relations with government regulators and deals with regulatory and supervisory policy. Many of you will remember he worked at City UK, where he's Managing Director of Public Affairs, Policy and Research. And of course, he spent 10 long and no doubt happy years at Prudential in a range of public affairs roles. Gives me great pleasure to hand over to Tim.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nigel. And it's lovely to, I have spoken at many ILC events over the years, and it's lovely to be back. This is fascinating and very interesting, very timely research. And I was speaking at an event last week at a conference on fintech, on financial technology in my sector. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about that session was the answer to every question wasn't, as you might think, here's some whizzy technology that can deal with this for you, or a way to automate. It was the importance of emphasizing the human and the emotional intelligence. And people were talking about things like AI and machine learning and algorithms, which are fantastic at many things, but they don't have empathy. They don't have emotional intelligence. And that is going to be a skill that is increasingly valued. And this report emphasizes yet again how absolutely critical that is as a dimension of giving financial advice. This is something that requires you to understand the person that you're talking to and to connect with them and to build a relationship of trust with them. And technology can certainly enable that and help that, as other panelists have said. But it can't replace that. And if it does, you lose a huge amount of the value and the benefit that this report makes very clear people receive above and beyond getting good financial outcomes. And this means that we can be confident that there will remain a role for that kind of human interaction, that kind of trust. And I think part of the reason for that is that people talk about financial products and financial services being complicated and complex. And sometimes that's true. I think often it's simpler than people may think. But what is always complex, and this is sort of making the same point as Tish in a slightly different way, is people's lives. How are they going to make decisions about their children, their grandchildren, their own future, care? How do they feel about retirement? What do they value? What's important to them? And actually, you can't give good financial advice without understanding those priorities, understanding someone's family, someone's friends, someone's goals in life. And this is where a huge amount of that value comes from. And this is really very reassuring to see that those that go through financial advice really see these benefits above and beyond getting a better financial outcome. I think as well, there's a few really interesting things for my sector. So I think the difference of views between men and women is really interesting and should be a little bit worrying, because if you look at it, well, the elements of the research that said that women are more likely to see taking financial advice as a risk, that it might make them feel less confident, that they might lose control by handing over to someone else. Well, that reflects other research on the advice sector where people can more easily build a trusting relationship with people that they see as like them. And that means we need to work on diversity, because we don't have enough women, we don't have enough people from ethnic minority backgrounds in the sector coming in as financial advisors. And the more we can attract, the more easily people can find an advisor that they can really connect with and get this both emotional and material benefit of engagement with advice. I think the points about mental health are also very well made. I mean, we know the impact that stress can have on individuals, and that money is often a core part of what causes stress in people's day-to-day lives, as well as the unknown. And there is quite a lot of research that links certainly feelings of being out of financial control with ill health. And particularly in retirement, there was some work done many years ago by an old friend of the ILC, James Lloyd, that looked at guaranteed incomes and that sense of knowing and being confident in your income in retirement. Now, it might not be that someone needs a guaranteed income to feel that, but it certainly added evidence that there were real health benefits to feeling that your long-term future was secure. And that's something we want to work to ensure is more accessible to a larger number of people. So thank you again to ILC for I think, adding something important and meaningful to this debate.
Thank you, Tim, for those thoughts. We're now going to move on to questions. I'm delighted to see that we have a very large number of questions. So let me apologise in advance to those that we don't get to during the time allotted for questions. Interestingly, there are a couple of COVID questions. If I can just find one. There's one from Sabuhi Gard of Incisive Media. How important is it to hire an advisor during this COVID-19 environment? And there's another one here, if I can just find it, along similar lines from Sophia Cleanthus. Since COVID-19, has the perception around the need for an advisor increased? So I'm going to go first to Tish, because I think Tish actually said something about that in her comments, and she may wish to expand a bit on that. So Tish, if you'd like to kick off.
Yes, thank you. I think little bit of research we've done within the Society of Later Life Advisors, it's obviously for those who've already got advisors, has been their reliance upon a financial advisor at this time. Definitely the vulnerability aspect of the pandemic has made people feel uncertain. Now, I know Jackie, for example, in the fantastic introduction she did to the research, did mention about pension freedoms, that was definitely research that showed that people were worried about the future, not sure what would happen. So without advice, a quick fix was to just take money because they felt they'd got some then. And that was in a way reassuring. But ongoing, what we've found is that we've had more people coming forward seeking advice from about July onwards, who perhaps haven't engaged with advice before. It's because they've realised that this has a long-term, the pandemic has a potential for a very long-term impact, and their initial just trying to get some money to make them feel assured, they're beginning to realise that that's a short-term plan and that a longer-term objective is needed. So we've definitely seen the pandemic as well making people consider long-term questions, going back to, as I mentioned before, issues around care funding.
Thank you, Tish. Andrew, is that something you've got some thoughts on?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Nigel. No, I kind of echo what Tish just said. The reality here is that people embark on a relationship with an advisor that's a long-term one. It's not about an immediate help. It might touch on those aspects, but it's about embarking on a relationship. And what we found is that during COVID, the reassurance that our advisors can provide existing clients has been super beneficial around peace of mind worry. First of all, they've typically planned to ensure that they've got a store of cash that's in need at times of crisis, but equally there's a lot of reassurance around the volatility of investment markets and making sure that people don't knee-jerk at the sight of volatility, which often leads to pretty poor financial outcomes for clients. So I think COVID has demonstrated some real value for advisors and what they give to clients. I think for me, the crisis doesn't jump at immediately going and seeking lots of new advice, but actually if you're embarking on a conversation with advice for the long term, it will drive the benefits that this research and ILC's previous research has shown.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on the COVID issue?
Yes, no, just say, I mean, from what we found from our members, one, I think, I mean, in the most difficult circumstances are always when people can get the most value from advice, because it's where their decisions are the most complex and the hardest. And as Andrew sort of hinted towards, often that advice at the moment might be don't do anything, don't panic and sell. And actually that could be the most valuable advice you get in these sorts of circumstances. I think we've certainly seen existing clients wanting to continue their relationships and continue to engage with their advisors, utilizing new technology at every age. And I know this is something, again, I obviously have done some work on before, that lots of the stereotypes of older people won't want to engage with their advisor through technology have been proven wrong during the pandemic, because they were perfectly happy to engage via Zoom or email or phone or text. So that has, I think, opened the eyes and opportunities for many. I think where there's another impact that people have not necessarily yet thought that much about, while for many the lockdown and the impact of COVID-19 has put an enormous stress on their finances, for those that have stayed employed, they've actually been building up quite significant cash savings because they're spending much less because they simply can't and because they're staying at home. And there may be people that need to understand what they might do with that significant amount of cash. And then if you combine that with the potential at some point next year of negative interest rates from the Bank of England, there are going to be a whole host of people who are looking to invest, possibly for the first time, and getting the right guidance and advice will be critical in order for them to have good outcomes.
I should say one of the first things when lockdown came, my wife and I did was rush off and update our wills. And I had the impression from our solicitor that we weren't the only ones. Right, now the next question I've got, which is a sort of related topic really, is, if I can just find it, it's from Helen Mee of the Clare Foundation. It's asking, are you aware of any research looking at the mental health implications of financial insecurity on people over retirement age? Anyone want to leap into that one?
Yeah, so I can. Yeah, so I think there's been quite a lot of research into this topic generally about mental health. I know that ILC's done work in that area as well. I know that Age UK also has looked at pensioner poverty and mental health. And I think generally there is this, because pensioner poverty is on the rise, the question about that impact that it has on mental health has become a more and more important question, and how older adults deal with that and how they can manage their finances and being able to understand their finances properly so that they can make those decisions. So there are lots of different pieces of research, and I think it's becoming more topical, especially now during COVID. When people are trying to think about their finances, what impact that COVID can have on them and how they can make those right decisions. So it's definitely a topic that's becoming more and more important in the area.
Thank you for that. Anybody want to add anything on that? Okay, let's move on to another interesting question. This is from an IFA from Harish Patel of IDS Financial Services. And the question is, how will regulation enhance confidence in taking financial advice? Perhaps that's one that Nigel might want to leap in on, as he's likely to be the one involved in the regulation at some level.
You might find those who are being regulated might have some stronger views on that, Nigel. But I think probably the biggest impact that regulation would have would be on the RDR rules, and effectively moving to a fee-based industry rather than a commission-based one. And you would hope, as that becomes better known and works through, that would boost confidence and reputation of the industry, that the advice you were getting was in your interests and not in the advisor. So I think that's probably the key thing. And I think generally from my experience of speaking to financial advisors, many of whom weren't very keen on the idea when it was being proposed, that they now accept it was the right thing to do and has changed how they work with their clients and has improved the relationship they have. So I think that would be the biggest impact I could see, but I'm not obviously somebody who is subject to this regulation on a day-to-day basis. Perhaps so some of the other panel are a bit closer to it than I am.
That might be a good entree to Tim having a go at this question then.
Yeah, no, I think we are certainly of the view that we have to have an appropriately regulated and supervised sector. And I think one of the concerns that we have at the moment is, and we've made this point to the Work and Pension Select Committee and the Treasury Select Committee and others, is that not PIMFA members, but there are some bad apples out there, and they lead customers to fall onto the financial services compensation scheme as they sort of fail and let them down. So I think it's incredibly important that we make sure that firms are supervised effectively as well as regulated. There's always a temptation for the regulator to leap for new regulation rather than to look at how it can implement the existing rules better. And also looking at the regulatory parameter, because if you have listened to commercial radio, you hear an awful lot of claims management company ads, and often they are aimed at people who have taken unregulated products. So if you look at London LCF or some of the other recent scandals, they are people taking their pensions and investing in unregulated products. And I think one of the things that's required for people to feel confident is that if they are putting their money in something that looks and feels and smells like a financial product, that it is regulated as one and is appropriate. And I think all our members are keen to have the highest professional standards, and in the end, that is what they are confident in delivering, and they get fantastic feedback from their customers. They want a regulatory environment that means that the bad apples can't do harm, partly, to protect their reputation, but mainly because their life's work is helping people get better financial outcomes. So they loathe it when they see people getting ripped off or scammed or let down.
Right, thank you for that. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, if I just come in, I mean, I kind of echo what the message Tim just gave. I guess the two key things I would add. One is the general suitability of advice is actually very, very good. The last suitability assessment from the FCA, had across the whole industry had very positive outcomes in terms of suitability of advice. So it is few and far between, but it is the bad apples, as Tim referred to, that can cause damage of trust in the industry. And there's the second point I was going to make was actually there's a real timing point here in terms of opportunity, because the FCA have re-picked up the kind of RDR and Pharma review, and I think they're due to present some elements of data or paper this month or around this month on that. But it's a real opportunity to look at some of the barriers to increasing supply of advice, and then amongst those, I'm sure, are some of the supervisory aspects that Tim referenced.
Yes, thank you for that. Now, here's an interesting question. This is from Jeanne de Servens, who is a consultant. And the question is, how do you build non-financial matters such as healthcare choices that have a significant monetary expense into financial advice? I suppose that's typically long-term care, but potentially other health-related issues. Who'd like to sort of comment on that?
I'm happy to comment on that if you wish, Nigel. That is a very interesting question. I'm assuming that means, how do you integrate that? Is that what you were asking? How do you build that into financial advice?
Yes, I think that's the question. Yeah.
Well, I think that there's two aspects. One will be when people need care, and that's very late in the day when people come along and they have a care need. Often, sadly, that's one where they're not taking advice till they're literally about to go into care, and financial advice can make a massive difference there, because obviously some people are very unaware of all the options, and although they're more limited at that late stage, there are still more options. The number of people who draw down their income just bit by bit without taking advice is so sad to see, when had they had advice, they could have made the best of their assets. But the other part, I think, is a wider issue. Is it's really important not to, in terms of advice, silo the care aspect into, well, that's what you do when you talk about later life issues. Because actually it isn't, because planning ahead and integrating the possibility of care into people's financial planning is really important for building financial resilience in later life. And I noticed in the report that one of the things that was said was specifically about that, around care funding, that a lot of people recognise that it probably would have an impact on their finances. They just weren't really sure how to resolve that. And that's where financial advice comes in. I mean, for example, just one, integrating it into giving pension advice, because people taking pension advice and wanting to take money early or withdraw money need to look at, well, what would be the impact if they needed care? So short-term decision-making can sometimes not take into account some of the healthcare decisions people will need to make later.
In fact, this ties in with the question that's come in from ILC partner Angia McCarthy of the National Innovation Centre for Ageing in Newcastle. The question is, what contributes to financial resilience in later life? Can non-financial advice help well-being? Well-being, that's something we used to hear a lot about from David Cameron a few years ago, but it's very much a theme running through the paper. So I might just go to Arun first of all. and see if she wants to pick that up, and then if anyone else wants to follow on that question. Arun, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the research is quite clear in that these non-financial benefits, they are about people's overall psychological disposition towards their finances. It's incredibly linked to their mental health. These are the aspects and dimensions that people think about when they think about their finances, when they think about the impact that it has in their finances. So I think that this research opens doors into, I guess, further research that can be looking at unpacking the impact that has on their mental health. But I think this is a good step forward in understanding these non-financial benefits and the full impact that they have. I think I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation that I think there's a case that, I think it's still the case that we're undervaluing the non-financial benefits and that important role that they have. I think many of us here agree that they have an important role, but I don't think the wider public are aware of that yet. And that message really needs to get across to them, because I think there is a view that while individuals might think, yes, financial advice might make you feel more confident, it might give me reassurance, I think those are just individual perceptions, and without the industry, without government, without that backing, without that support, without demonstrating those financial benefits, those non-financial benefits are actually there, they're real, and people experience it, people won't be confident in wanting to take financial advice.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that?
I've got just a couple of things, Nigel.
Andrew.
I think one thing that comes through in the research, and I think it's possibly an element of misperception around the role of the advisor. Obviously, they provide financial advice, but actually the conversations they have with clients are much broader than that. I think Tim mentioned it earlier around goals, lifestyle, understanding the family position, etc. But typically, advisors ensure that the client's total affairs are in order. That's advising around making sure wills are in place, power of attorneys in place, helping people through navigating the kind of long-term care market. It's much broader than just, there's a pension and here's some investment within it. And I think when you think about clients that work in the run-up to retirement, during retirement, in later life, etc., and dealing with long-term care, actually, that's when some of the real value comes through in terms of the advisor-client trusted relationship.
Can I just reinforce that, Nigel?
Yes, Trish, go ahead.
Yeah, and funnily, strangely, I've had two opinions come across my desk today, both that absolutely support what Andrew says, both in relation to the wider aspects of financial advice, of working and integrating with, for example, the legal profession. Clearly, as a barrister, that was obviously something I have an interest in. So I think that question was a good one. I think the issue around there is exactly that. It's around building resilience by earlier planning, by integrating all that. And in your report, Arun, as well, of course, it came out and said, which is also important, the issues, two of them, one around building financial capability and the other around building confidence. And I would say for later life, that confidence issue is key, because certainly we tend to see that although there's a lot of, where there are lots of options, sometimes people lack they just want someone to help them to navigate through all those choices. And someone else said today, one of the worst things is, when you don't do something at all. Sometimes it's good to do nothing at all, but sometimes inertia is a really bad thing for financial resilience, and not being able to just make that choice and feeling the confidence that you, particularly I would say, just one point, when you are dealing with other people's affairs, because no one's mentioned that today, but with later life, a lot of older people are having their affairs dealt with by attorneys. And nobody more than attorneys needs to feel that they are doing the right thing because they have the added responsibility of taking care of someone else's finances.
Yes, thank you. That's a good point. One last very quick question, which turns on the advice gap, which Nigel in particular touched on, The question from AR is, how can financial advice be introduced in places like the NHS and social care settings where a lot of employees are on low wages and could actually do with proper advice? Who'd like to pick that one up? I mean, this is clearly a part of the economy where people are just not going to be able to afford to pay for an IFA. So is there any way around it?
I mean, those with long memories will remember that in the early days of the Money Advice Service and the FSA's financial education and financial capability strategy, they did look at some of this. So you did have, for example, FSA guides being given to expectant mothers by their doctors that gave them financial information about planning to have a child. And there was certainly some trialing of retirement guidance. Again, I think printed material provided when people go for their over 50 health check. And I think we would certainly encourage the Money and Pension Service to look at what they can do with the NHS and with healthcare settings in order to boost access to guidance. Financial advisors do operate in private hospitals and private settings, but generally NHS hospitals don't feel and NHS healthcare settings don't want to bring those individuals in. But I think if we can work on ensuring access to the Money and Pension Service, and then there's an effective triage from maps that can point people towards full advice as and when it becomes appropriate, if they've had a quantity of money or a complexity of issue where it's required. That's probably the most effective way to ensure that it's a trusted public service partner to the public service in healthcare scenarios.
Could I just add, Nigel, that
yes,
within social care, obviously, the bulk of the delivery of social care is through the private sector. And there are, two main bodies that represent those, but Care England with Professor Martin Green, and obviously the National Care Association with Nadra Ahmed. Now, I haven't spoken on this issue directly to either of those, but I am on one of the boards of the National Care Association. One thought I have, because I think it's a very interesting point, is maybe one way to start to do this, because these are people on low incomes, would be at the moment there is a big gap in the care sector for recruitment. And so the care homes are much more looking now to try and retain staff and to add value. And the guidance is all around mental well-being, health and resilience. So it might be to get them to put some kind of initial just basic information, perhaps through maps or something, in as part of what they offer to try and help their employees. So in the context of helping them as a benefit, a bit like you do with other sectors where you have retirement advice. But I think that might be an easier way in, because the care homes want to support their care workers and they're looking for ways to do that.
Thank you, Trish. I'm going to have to bring the Q&A to a close there. As we said, we close at 3:30. Just a few final observations. I think from my personal point of view, and I think this is a point Tim may have made at one point, I'm more than a little heartened that there seems to be enthusiasm for the face-to-face approach rather than the robo-advice, which personally I've never seen as a runner for most people. And I think all that ties in with some of the fundamental themes of Arun's work, which is that this is all about people having confidence, the advice they're getting in their financial future, having peace of mind, well-being, if you like. These 18 million plus people who FCA have identified who really do need advice and aren't getting it. And even things, emotional benefits of being able to feel that instead of worrying and losing sleep over your long-term financial plans, that you do have a plan and you have someone to talk to about it. And I think the final point I'd make, I guess, is that despite all this technology, people still value the idea of a personal relationship with an advisor, somebody they can trust, somebody they feel isn't going to talk down to them, ask them embarrassing questions that they don't have the answers to, and who will engage with their aspirations and their concerns. And I think that's really very heartening indeed. I was also very struck. I think, sorry, just on qualification. I mean, people are looking for trust, they're looking for impartiality, they're looking for people skills and the ability to communicate, all of which are terribly important. And one final thought, I suppose, for me is that we often talk about this Berlin Wall between advice and guidance and the regulatory consequences of both. But it seems that for a lot of people, guidance, and this is one of the most interesting nuggets in the report, a lot of people see guidance as a way of preparing for meeting an advisor, because the guidance will at least tell them the questions are likely to be asked and the sort of information, perhaps documentation, they'll have to dig out in order to start discussing their future with an advisor. So the two are not mutually exclusive, which sometimes people treat them as. But there's still a lot to be done. There aren't enough advisors, and perhaps there aren't enough advisors of the right quality, or with all these right qualities around. And the Money and Pension Service, for example, will do its bit and so on. But there are still significant barriers to obtaining advice. So I think this is a very fitting second volume, if you like, to the first volume, which was about the financial benefits of advice, which in one sense much more obvious, but the two naturally go together. So I would like to finish by thanking all our speakers and everyone who joined us for our launch today. I apologise profusely to the many questions we have not been able to tackle in the time available, but I hope some of them at least were covered in the various contributions. Big thanks, of course, again to St James's Place Wealth Management for supporting this report. The report itself in full is available from our website, as indeed is news on the ILC's latest webinars and all our news. Visit our website, please, at ilcuk.org.uk. Join us this Thursday if you can. You can see the details on the screen. We have another webinar, Climate Change in an Aging World. There'll be a discussion on how we shape a Green New Deal that encompasses an aging society New Deal as well. I should say also we have a major retirement income summit, a joint venture with the PPI coming up shortly. And if you're interested in participating in that, or even better, sponsoring it, do contact my colleague Redvers Lee, whose information is at the bottom of that slide. And of course, many of you will have attended our previous Future of Aging conferences, this big annual event, which we've had in the past and has been a huge success. Yes, it's going to be virtual this time, like everything else, but I think it's going to be really thought-provoking. And you can see some of the speakers we've got coming, including Guy Opperman, the Pensions Minister, Andrew Dilnott, etc. So we've got some very good speakers coming. It's Thursday, the 3rd of December, as you'll see there. And there's the details if you want to register. And I hope we can welcome you in the very near future at any one of these events. And as I say, do please keep in touch with our webinars, which are fast and furious. Lots of them have been coming along since the original lockdown. And we seem to have huge attendances, not least internationally. So please do keep in touch. And we hope to see you, or at least hear from you again very soon. Thank you, everybody.